Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us with the British in India. A special welcome to those from different time zones and particularly to our three distinguished speakers, Squadron Leader Rana Chhina, who is joining us tonight from New Delhi, where it's currently 11:30 p.m. Second speaker, Andrew Ward, who is joining us from California, where it's 11 a.m. And third speaker, Dr. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones from the United Kingdom. Rana Chhina is Secretary and Editor at the Centre for Armed Forces Historical Research, United Service Institution of India, New Delhi. The USI, a national security and defense services think tank, was established in 1870 by Major General Sir Charles Macgregor in Simla. The Centre for Armed Forces Historical Research was established under its aegis in 2000. It is headed by Rana Chhina, who followed a distinguished Air Force career with the authorship of many books on Indian military history. He was Vice President of the Indian Military History Society, UK, and was awarded an honorary MBE for services to First World War centenary commemorations and the Order of Leopold for his work on the Indian contribution on the Belgian front in World War I for India in Flanders Fields, which he jointly authored with a Belgian historian. One of the Centre for Armed Forces Historical Researchers projects is a series of battlefield guides, of which Kanpur and Lucknow are the first, and Rana will discuss these and Indian viewpoints on 1857, not to mention the Battle of Delhi. He is working on a book on that subject in the first of tonight's presentations. Our other two speakers, Andrew Ward and Rosie Llewellyn-Jones, sorry, I'm just admitting someone, are the leading authorities on the uprisings at Kanpur and Lucknow. Andrew Ward's magisterial Our Bones Are Scattered, the Kanpur massacres and the Indian Mutiny of 1857 was published in 1996 to international acclaim. It is a detailed account of the tragic events that unfolded in this important garrison town when the besieged soldiers and civilians surrendered to rebel forces and were subsequently massacred. Andrew is known in the United States as the author of another major work on controversial Civil War battle Fort Pillow, and as a former contributing editor to Atlantic Monthly and columnist for the Washington Post. His interest in 1857 stems from his childhood in Delhi during the Uprising's centennial. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones is well known in the UK and India as a historian of the colonial period. Her doctoral thesis at SOAS was published as A Fatal Friendship, the Nawabs, the British and the City of Lucknow, and she has written, amongst others, biographies of Wajid Ali Shah, last king of Awadh, deposed by the British in 1856, of Major General Claude Martin of the East India Company, whose fantastical country house, now La Martiniere College, was the scene of bitter fighting during the British advance, and two other works on the uprising besides Lucknow 1857. Rosie was awarded an MBE in 2015 for services to the British Association for Cemeteries in South Asia and to British Indian Studies. She is the author of 3 books published in the last 2 years: The Estate of Major General Claude Martin at Lucknow, on which she spoke to us last year, Lucknow 1857, the subject of her talk tonight, and published in January this year, Empire Building, the Construction of British India 1690 to 1860. We are fortunate to have 3 such distinguished historians here tonight. The format of tonight's talk is that Rana, Andrew, and Rosie will talk in turn for around 30 minutes each, followed by question and answer. Please type any questions you have at any point into the chat box, saying to which speaker they should be directed, and I shall read them out at the end of all the talks. Rana Chhina is our first speaker, and I'm now going to hand over to him. Rana, the rostrum is yours. I'm now just going to wipe myself and the other speakers off the screen, and it will all be yours and your PowerPoint. So
may I share my screen now?
Yes, it's all over to you.
Okay, great, thank you. Is that visible?
Yes. Yes.
All right. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And at the outset, I'd like to thank the British in India Historical Trust for giving me this opportunity to be part of such a distinguished panel and to present my views on my perspective on the 1857 events, mutiny or uprising. This is, as all of you are aware, it's a complex question, and I'm actually going to take the coward's way out and not answer it. But what I will do is present certain facts and different perspectives on those events and allow you to draw your own conclusions. The project in itself, the battlefield guides that Valerie just referred to, the thought had come to me earlier because we at the center that I work with, as part of our different activities, we also look at military heritage. And one of the things that I'm always very concerned about is how so much of our heritage, particularly that's centered around battlefields, tends to get lost increasingly as urbanization increases, and there are pressures on the land, and people aren't even aware of the significance of, or the historical significance of some of these spaces or built structures and so on and so forth. And when we were working on the India and the Great War centenary commemoration earlier, during my visits to the battlefields in northern France and Flanders, what struck me was that local economies were actually being sustained by this battlefield tourism, and I thought that this is a good way that to involve local communities with these spaces and these structures, etc., so that if they can derive some economic gain out of conducting tours and so on and so forth, then there is an incentive for them to ensure that these sites are preserved. So that's basically the background to how we came about conceptualizing this series. And I think HarperCollins is actually, we were just talking about this, has done a good job. Now, as you can see on your slide, there is there's a painting of a Bengal infantry regiment, and as most of you, I presume, are already familiar with the with the larger context of the 1857 events, how it was, how it's believed, or during the colonial period, is referred to as the Indian Mutiny, the Great Sepoy Mutiny. But over a period of time, historians of all hues have, I think, veered around to accepting the fact that it went beyond just a military mutiny, although there is no doubt that the actions of the sepoys, the mutiny itself, in a very legal military term, did serve as a catalyst for a larger conflagration. The painting is, as you can see, is of the 35th Bengal Native Infantry. This was the regiment that was raised in 1798, and at the time of the uprising, it actually was faithful, but there was some disaffection, and interestingly enough, they were based at Sialkot, and they marched down from Sialkot with Nicholson when all people had assumed that they would be disbanded. But on the march, he disbands them at Philor. So, and if you'll also notice, they actually have three colors. So the third color, the one that the priest, the Brahmin priest is garlanding, that was the third color that they had received for their services with Lord Lake and Victory. So, oh yeah, I think that's I like that quote because when we are looking back at the past through the lens of the present, it is problematic because we tend to judge people, personalities, places, attitudes from the present standpoint, but then that isn't always necessarily an accurate one. As I mentioned, there are two very diametrically opposite views when we talk about the events of 1857, particularly from an Indian perspective. One, of course, you have the mutiny, and the other is a war of independence. On the right, you can see that's the Mutiny Memorial over there. And I'll show you a close-up of the plaque that's there at the bottom, which was set up in 1972 at when 25th anniversary of India's independence. Interestingly enough, the Mutiny Memorial, this is on the ridge. It forms the extreme right of the British position on the ridge and is situated at what was then called Taylor's Battery. It's today called Ajitgarh. Ajitgarh is Tower of Victory, and that's an Indian nationalist name given to it. Now, around that time, actually, there was a proposal that, this was a colonial structure. It glorified those people who had suppressed Indian nationalism and therefore should be destroyed. But the Prime Minister actually said, no, this is part of our history and we need to preserve it. And so what they did do, they added this inscription in 4 different languages. And it says over there, the enemy of the inscription on this monument were those who rose against colonial rule and fought bravely for national freedom in 1857. In memory of the heroism of these immortal martyrs for Indian freedom, this plaque was unveiled on the 25th anniversary of the nation's attainment of freedom, 28th August 1972. So I just thought I'd show that as emblematic or symbolic of the Indian official position. The term War of Independence is actually, it originates from this book on the left, which was written by Veer Savarkar, who was an Indian nationalist and a revolutionary, although he later he recanted after he was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Andamans. I'm sorry, the thing on the right is from the book and it's a bit blurred, but it says first published in England in 1909 and immediately proscribed. And so this particular edition, first authorized and public edition, published in India, 1947. So, the nationalist viewpoint that the events of 1857 actually constituted a first war of independence was something that came about after independence, and this is more or less the official terminology that is ascribed to the 1857 events. I personally think I would go more for this, that calling it an uprising. I think it's more accurate because these events went beyond just a military mutiny. I think they were, but to call them a war of independence is giving it a color which didn't really exist insofar as political definitions went at that point in time. So I thought to myself, I said, you know, how was it known to us in India? You know, if you leave the official kind of semantics aside, in the Punjab when I was growing up, and I think through most of North India, when you talk about the events of 1857, it was called the Ghadar. Now, Ghadar is this is from an 1887 dictionary, English Urdu dictionary. So I just thought that I highlighted some of the different meanings that are ascribed to it. So obviously they did not, if it had been known popularly as a war of independence, it would have been Jang-e-Azadi, which is war of independence. But Ghadar it actually goes beyond just mutiny, rebellion, sedition. It implies a time of chaos, a time of unsettlement, of instability, of rebellion, of passion. All kinds of things, you know, roll into that term. Now, I think it's important over here, rather than really looking at, you know, what are the Indian perspectives from a academic or a political point of view, from a popular point of view, the events of 1857, they are remarkable in that they still arouse a great deal of passion, particularly in areas of North India. If you go and you talk about this, you will find that you receive a very emotional and a very impassioned kind of a response to it. Part of the reason, I think, is that, you know, that during the course of the suppression of this uprising, the authorities visited rural communities with fire and sword. Unlike other conventional conflicts, when two warring armies would meet, they would fight and they'd move on. And so even other important events that have happened over there in the past, battles, have not impacted those communities as much as 1857 has. And they still remember, because rural communities have very, very long memories. There's a friend of mine, the gentleman who's actually doing the Merit volume for this series. He went out as part of, you know, he's very passionate about the whole subject. He got started off, as Rosie will know, Mrs. Jean Thomas. Jean's ancestors were part of the La Martiniere garrison, and she's married to General Matthew Thomas, who's a paratrooper. So they had started the Merit Historical Society. So he actually went out into the neighboring countryside, you know, looking at these at the Merit depositions for 1857, and he identified some of these villages where engagements had taken place. And, you know, lo and behold, he says, I spoke to some of these people. They said, you know, who are you? What are you doing here? Why have you come? He says, I'm here to research 1857. They say, come here. This is the point. They were able to tell him where the guns were sighted by the British, the directions in which the fire went, which houses were hit, who were the families whose ancestors were hanged, and so on and so forth. This was living history for them. So a few years ago, we had, again, I think Rosie will remember, there was a group of people from the UK who wanted to, I think, put down a plaque somewhere in Meerut. And they were literally chased by a mob, you know, because they said, oh, you know, this is not done. It was thought to be very provocative. Now, obviously, these people who came there with all good intent, they didn't realize that this was still an event that was likely to evoke such a passionate response. So that's I think the key takeaway over here is that this is still not a dead issue. It's still something that will evoke passion amongst people when you're discussing it. While now, interestingly enough, we've a lot of the accounts that we read are, well, not a lot, I think almost all of them, contemporary accounts were from British sources. There's a co-author of mine, he came across a photograph of a group of British officers, and at the back there was one Indian officer, and he said, he started doing some research, and he wrote this paper which was called Honorary Lieutenant Colonel Sheikh Hidayat Ali. And then I did some further research, and I published another follow-up to that. And then when Cliff and I were doing History of the Indian Order of Merit, which, as you would be aware, is or was India's highest gallantry award. It was the oldest instituted gallantry award in the Commonwealth, predated the Victoria Cross by about 17 years, and was the Indian equivalent of the Victoria Cross up till 1911 in terms of gallantry. So I was at the National Archives, and I'd called for I'd called for a file, and they sent me the wrong file. And I said, oh gosh, it's a wasted day. And I opened the file, and in that I found a report submitted by this gentleman on the military causes of the mutiny. And, I said, yeah, that really blew me away. And it was quite a remarkable report. He actually submits the first one somewhere in February 1857. Mind you, the mutiny breaks out in May. The interesting thing about him is there are a number of interesting things. If you notice his rank, he's lieutenant colonel. This is in about 1878. He is actually a lieutenant colonel, which was unprecedented. The highest rank that an Indian could ascribe to at that time was a Subedar Major. They made him a lieutenant colonel, which just shows his ability. Now, at that point in time, when he's writing these reports, he was a Havildar. He was, in 1857, he was already a third generation soldier. His father had served in the same regiment. He was in 8th Bengal Native Infantry. His grandfather had served in the same regiment. They'd all been VCOs. He and his two brothers were serving in the regiment. So, he was somebody for whom the army was everything. And he then goes on to so when Rattray was raising the Bengal Military Police Battalion, that is the time he asked for him to join him as a drill Havildar, which he does, and then subsequently he rises and so on and so forth. But that's a separate thing altogether. So the military causes of the mutiny, which was summed up by Hidayat Ali, Sheikh Hidayat Ali, were very interesting, and I've just kind of run through them so that it's important to understand how these things kind of led to this boiling over of sentiment against the British in 1857. According to him, he says that the problem starts with the Afghan war. When they crossed the Attock, in the Afghan war, he said, as far as the Hindus were concerned, they had to perform their ablutions, they had to wash, and all the rest. Now, suddenly they were in this cold climate, they could do none of that. They had to buy their food because the Jawans used to cook their own food. Now they had to buy it from the hands of Muslims because there was no, central commissariat that was supplying them. They had to go to the bazaar and buy this stuff, and they were buying it from people whom they ordinarily would not accept food or water from. On top of that, they were made to wear leather poshteens and so on and so forth. And then, of course, when they go into captivity, all kinds of things. So even in 1857, these men, the men who had survived the first Afghan war and had come back, were and were serving in the army, were socially ostracized. They were not allowed to sit, they were not allowed to smoke, they were not allowed to cook with the other men of the regiment. So you can imagine the kind of resentment and the undercurrents that brought into play. Then other things, the English hospitals, there's a lot of social reform that happens, messing in jail regulations, where they say that you can't have your caste marks and so on and so forth. Another major reason, of course, was the annexation of Awadh, which Rosie will, I'm sure, talk about subsequently. But this and some of the reforms that had happened earlier, which took away a lot of the privilege of the landed gentry, the landed communities, from which the sepoys came, that all contributed to this resentment. Then, of course, the activities of the missionaries, the stoppages of Bhatta. Bhatta was allowance given for foreign service, but as the British Empire kept expanding, areas that earlier these sepoys were given these allowances for, they were now incorporated. They were still in the same place, but now that place was no longer, the Punjab or Sindh or something. It was part of the British Empire, so therefore their allowances were stopped. Then, of course, seniority, the changed behavior of officers and the reduced interaction with the men, and of course the spark that lights the flame, that is the cartridges. Mem Saabs. Interestingly enough, that's from it just goes to show, it's from the Delhi Gazette of 1852. There's a quote that talks about the attitude that the officers were starting to display towards their men. Now, there was obviously an increased alienation or a difference between the men and the officers, which had not existed before. All of you would be aware of that. So that all added to this deep feeling of resentment amongst the troops. I won't go into the cartridge and the loss of caste, but that, of course, is the Enfield rifle, which causes all this problem. The cartridge was this waxed paper that they had to actually tear off. They had to bring it to the mouth, but they didn't necessarily tear it. They tore it off with their hands, and then they rammed it into the rifle. But even when this was these orders were rescinded, but by then the damage had already been done, and faith had broken down, or trust had broken down. One of the things which we talk about, how this was a severe shock to the colonial administration, was the fact that they started making direct admissions to the Order of British India and the Order of Merit, including the higher grades, during the uprising, because by then they were obviously very desperate to ensure that they retain the loyalty of those soldiers that was still with them. Now, so basically, I would just say that the events of 1857 are unique, in the history of South Asia, because of the kind of passion that they still continue to evoke. That's the Order of British India. There you can see Indian officer Risaldar from Garner's Horse, who's wearing the OBI and his other campaign medals. That's the Indian Order of Merit, first class, which was in gold. Interesting now, this was actually, it should be my last slide, although this shows Their Majesties, the King and Queen, George V, and Queen Mary, during the Delhi Darbar in 1911. And the place where this photograph is taken is the Zeb Jharoka. This is the point where on the morning of the 11th of May, the rebel Sawars of the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry gallop across the bridge of boats, and they come, and this was the traditional point where they would invoke the help of the emperor. So when they started calling out to the emperor, he hears the noise and he calls for Captain Douglas, who was the Kiladar, the keeper of the fort, and he asks them, he says, go and see what these chaps want, tell them to go away. And then Douglas tells them to come from the other side, which they do. But the point is that even in 1911, the British or the King Emperor feels, or the British in India feel that it's important for the King Emperor to replicate the customs, tradition, and the traditional kind of processes of the Mughal Empire. And last but not least, I mean, there's a very interesting argument that was put forth actually in 1922 by a British historian who said that, look, the East India Company actually held its power by the firmans of the Mughal emperor. And Bahadur Shah Zafar in 1857 was still a sovereign. A sovereign cannot, under law, rebel against his subjects. It's the subjects who rebel against the sovereign. So therefore, the interesting point is, if you notice, that the trial that is held of Bahadur Shah Zafar, of the last Mughal emperor, in the Red Fort in Delhi after the city is captured, it was not a trial, it was a military tribunal, because they could not try him under law. So, I mean, that's again another interesting point. I would just, I thought it'd be interesting, if just take maybe 2 or 3 minutes, I may overshoot, but I just would like to share some photographs of Delhi. This is what I normally do when we do the walk on the ridge. I start at the Flagstaff Tower, and then so the Flagstaff Tower is the extreme left of the British position, and the Mutiny Memorial is actually the extreme right. The Crow's Nest is behind it, and Sammy House is in front of it. This is the Flagstaff Tower as it exists today. You walk up there from the Vice Chancellor's office, which actually was the old Viceroy's house where Mountbatten, Louis Mountbatten, actually proposed to Edwina when he was here with the Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII, in 1922. This is something really interesting. And if anybody in the audience has actually bought this, there was a series of these sketches that came up for auction about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. And I mean, and this is from that catalog. And this is a sketch of the Flagstaff Tower on the 22nd of August, 1857. And, it very clearly shows, it's not very clear over here, but if you look at it, otherwise, on the right, that tree, near the tree, there is a battery. And the tree is also where they found the cart with, the bodies of the 3 officers who were killed at the Kashmiri Gate. And then they are buried in an enclosure on the other side. This is that enclosure which I found, and I was thrilled to find it. They've now put a gate, an iron kind of thing over there. The original markers that were inside, they have gone, but we know what the inscriptions were. And at some point, I hope that we'll be able to get the Delhi authorities to recreate those inscriptions. This is one of the few well, not monuments, but a few buildings relating to 1857 on the ridge itself. It's one of the old guardhouses. There are 2 of them, which lead from the ridge down into the cantonment, or led in 1857. I was very, very, very excited to find this. This is the main magazine inside. If you look at that, it's actually a Borstal house for boys. And I always wondered, I said, where is the powder magazine? Where? And then I looked at the map, and lo and behold, there was a road which said Magazine Road. So I said, that's a clue. So then I followed that and ended up with this thing, and it still exists, although you can't go in. That's the outside of that. That's the Chow Burja, which is the center of, or the mosque picket as it was called. This was the center of the, center of the Delhi position. That is it as it was then on the left. And on the right, if you notice that little window over there, and then there's a little window on the extreme left under the dome. So that's all that's left of this. The rest of the building has fallen down now. That's the observatory, which was more or less the right center thing. At the background, you can see Hindu Rao's house. That's the observatory 1857, and this is the observatory now on the right. That's Hindu Rao, that's Hindu Rao's house. Then that's Reed's Gurkhas. Look at, this is Hindu Rao's house. Please look at the porch on the extreme left. And there is the porch on the extreme left as it is today. It's a government hospital, but you can see that semicircular thing on top, and there is the semicircular thing on top over there on the left top. We've already covered the 1857 Mutiny Memorial, the Water Bastion. This is, so that's the storming of Delhi. Kashmiri Gate 1857, Kashmiri Gate 1850 on the left, 1857 on the present day on the right. The bastion on the left, the same position today. This is from the top of the Kashmiri Gate. It was actually an octagonal kind of thing, and you can see that over there. That's the inscription which still is there. It's you can't see it over here, but it's down there at the near one of those arches. St. James's Church still stands. This ball, which was riddled with musket shot, vanished, I think, shortly after independence in 1947. Ludlow Castle no longer exists. It was pulled down and is now the site of a girls' school, which bears the same name. Where the river used to flow is now the ring road. So when you actually drive down, you will be driving underneath those arches, and you will be driving on this on the water. That's the road now. Yeah. So this is the end bit, just Qudsiya Bagh. Now you can see that this is the arched bridge now, and there it is over there on the left in 1857. That's the mosque, but this is from the other side, the mosque over there. But that photograph was taken from the other face behind. So I've finished. I'm sorry, I just kind of went all over the place, but I just thought it would be interesting to share some of the stuff that I was doing with with Delhi.
Rana, thank you very much. It must now be midnight in New Delhi, and I can't imagine how weary you must be, but thank you so much for that really fascinating talk, and I look forward to your book on Delhi being published and joining these wonderful volumes that we're here to talk about tonight, and look forward to having you back in connection with that at a better time. So I'm now going to find Andrew. Let me just spotlight him. Here we go. Where has he gone? Here he is. Hello, Andrew.
Yes.
And we have your PowerPoint up.
Yes.
So
excellent.
I'm going to make myself disappear and ditto Rana. So there we go.
Very good.
And that leaves you alone. And we've got a couple of people who are late arrivals. Let me let them in. Here we are. They're now in time for your talk.
All right. My portion of the proceedings will concern Kanpur, to which, for reasons I should probably take up with a psychiatrist, I have now devoted 2 books. If we could go back one, yes, thank you. If you leaf through almost any Anglo-Indian family album of the late 1800s, and amid the inevitable pictures of the Taj and the tiger shoot and the bungalow, you'll come upon an icon of the memorial well at Kanpur. a marble angel, a sorrowing marble angel standing within a pierced Gothic screen. And if you look closely enough, and the mildew and white worms that afflict the libraries of the Raj haven't yet done their worst, you might make out an inscription: sacred to the perpetual memory of a great company of Christian people, chiefly women and children, who near this spot were cruelly massacred by the followers of the Nana Dandu Pant of Bitur and cast the dying with the dead into the well below on the 15th of July, 1857. Ever since the British gained suzerainty or dominion over India with its victory at Plassey in 1757, Indian astrologers had predicted that the East India Company's reign would last for only 1 century. In its impatience to expand its markets and instruct the heathen in Christian civics, the company's agents had inevitably trod upon the bejeweled toes of the Rajas, Nizams, and Begums who had ruled India in the vacuum of Mughal dissolution. And no less dangerously, they had alienated the powerful landlords, priests, and mullahs who steered the subcontinent's soul. The city of Kanpur, the next picture, was a company invention arising in the late 1700s on the banks of the Ganges, 1,000 navigable miles inland from Calcutta. What began as a garrison became a tabula rasa for Anglo-Indian industrialists whose woolen mills and leather works sprouted up around the outskirts of the cantonment, adding their smoke and stench to the dust of the North Indian plains. Distinct from the crowded city of factories and bazaars was the military cantonment, a mock suburbia of verandaed bungalows and dusty gardens enclosed in walls of mud and brick. There were British officers' clubs and a race course and a Freemasons' lodge, a racket court, a library, even a small theater. It was during the British East India Company's wars with the Marathas that Kanpur became the company's second largest military station. At the close of those wars, the company banished the defeated head of the Maratha Confederacy, Peshwa Baji Rao II, to the nearby town of Bitur, where he lived in opulence on a generous pension. Before his death, the ex-Peshwa named a youth named Dandu Pant as his adoptive heir. But upon the Peshwa's passing, Governor General Lord Dalhousie refused to recognize Dandu Pant's claim to his father's titles and pensions. This was in contravention of Hindu custom, and styling himself Nana Sahib, he appealed in vain to Dalhousie to reverse his decision. And in this image is interesting. It was up in the home of one of his generals, Tatya Tope's, a descendant of Tatya Tope, and in Kanpur, who is, it's probably the most accurate of the images. There are many other images floating around that represent themselves to be Nana Sahib, but this fits the descriptions that were given by people who knew him. And then we move on to enter Azimullah Khan, a brilliant young Afghani orphan who had somehow disgraced himself as a table servant to a British family. Embittered, but nonetheless fluent in English and familiar with British mores, he apparently persuaded Nana Sahib to send him to London to plead his case for the company's board of directors. Dressed in Western clothing, like this man who preceded him, Azimullah cut a memorable figure in London, but ultimately failed in his mission. Nevertheless, stopping in the Crimea on his way home, he had the privilege of observing the British military at its most hapless. Returning to Bitur, he eagerly confided to his prince that the British were grossly overextended, all bluff, and might be swept off the subcontinent with a breath. It did not seem an entirely far-fetched proposition if Nana Sahib could strike up alliances with the other Maratha princes Calcutta had disenfranchised, and work on the growing disaffection among the native troops upon whose loyalty the company depended, and perhaps even ally himself with Russia, why couldn't Indians rid themselves of these greedy, arrogant aliens they exponentially outnumbered? However, his liege, like Baji Rao II before him, believed in keeping all his options open. And as Azimullah endeavored to plot a rebellion among the company troops encamped at Kanpur, Nana Sahib hosted local British officers and their families at his palace, joined the Masons, and when rebellion seemed imminent, offered his own bodyguard to the collector to guard the treasury. To Nana Sahib's way of thinking, it was simply a matter of statesmanship. It was not until the spring of 1857, after all 4 regiments of native troops rebelled, that he offered himself up as their at least titular commander. What followed at Kanpur was a succession of horrors unparalleled even in that bloody year. The European community, officers, bureaucrats, merchants, missionaries, engineers, and their families fled to a feeble entrenchment, belatedly excavated by the local commander, General Sir Hugh Massey Wheeler, an aged veteran of campaigns in Afghanistan and the Punjab. He harbored a sentimental belief that his troops would never rebel against the man they had dubbed Hamla, or attack, and almost to the last minute reassured the community that the rebellion would bypass Kanpur. In the proof, he was mistaken. His charges suffered weeks of starvation, bombardment, assaults, sniper fire, heat stroke, and disease. Next image. That's the entrenchment. It was about 10 acres, and it afforded only there were 2 barracks that were the chief shelters, and they were not enough for the over 1,000 souls who poured into the entrenchment. And the next, of the perhaps 1,000 souls who entered the entrenchment, perhaps half had lost their lives by the time the survivors agreed to surrender on condition that they be provided with safe passage to Allahabad. This picture is a drawing. It's the only drawing that survives from the entrenchment. Emma Halliday drew it, and it's an image which I have reversed. It's actually black on white instead of white on black, of the sleeping quarters within one of the barracks that was afforded the officer's family. Emma Halliday had recently come to Kanpur, and her husband had just returned with her from the campaign against the Santals, the Bengali tribe that had come to protest their treatment. And I've always thought the Santal rebellion was a factor in the causes of the mutiny, because the British employed hanging parties to punish captured Santals, something the sepoys would have observed. Okay, yes, well, here are the sepoys ordering around. They had all discarded their uniforms by this time. Gratefully, the uniforms were a terrible burden, actually, in the heat of North India. And I'm sorry, the next image, yes. Here, after, let's see, perhaps 1,000 souls who entered the entrenchment, perhaps half had lost their lives by the time the survivors agreed to surrender. And here you see, this was made for a documentary for Channel 4. And I've always thought it was extraordinarily accurate representation of the conditions under which many of the people in the garrison were, you can see the entrenchment wall was, as one person said, was low enough for an active cow to have bolted. And this was, and you can see too from the perforations in the barrack behind them, and that's roofless because the roof of the hospital barracks were set on fire. That they endured an unbelievable siege. Move on. Here's a photograph taken months after the garrison departed. And yeah, this is a drawing that was taken in the at around the same time, and you can see the rebel positions. These are the ditches, the trenches the rebels occupied during the siege. So after passing, this is this is where the boats were provided for the garrison at Sati Chowra Ghat. Sati Chowra was a fisherman's village down by the river, and at the time, unlike in this photograph, the river was at its lowest, so there were sandbars, which you'll see in subsequent images, extending well out away from the riverbank. Here is a more representative of the conditions in which these boats were boarded. You can see the sandbars along the way after the river had receded in the summer. This was taken in 1858. Okay, after passing through a growing crowd of jeering spectators, the garrison proceeded down to Sati Chowra Ghat, where they boarded a fleet of thatched boats. But just as they began to push off from the muddy bank, the boatmen set fire to their crafts, and under the direction of Azim Mullah and Nana Sab's adjutants, the rebels opened fire. Men, women, and children were burned to death, drowned, or slaughtered as they struggled ashore. Among them were the siblings of young Amelia Horn, newly arrived from Lucknow, who was herself abducted from the riverbank by a Muslim cavalryman after her entire family had lost their lives. The surviving men were executed and the women and children incarcerated in a complex known as the Bibigar. There, weeks later, as a British relief force closed in, they were all put to the sword and their bodies thrown into a well. This is the interior of the Bibigar as the soldiers encountered it when they arrived a day late. You'll see a great deal of blood on the floor, broken water pots, which accounts for the fact that the blood was still wet when they walked through it. And you'll see finger mark, handprints, women's bonnets in the back. It was a nightmarish scene. And it was rendered more so later by soldiers who wrote various imprecations on the walls that said, save us, oh, we are prisoners, and so on. But this is a more accurate representation of what they encountered. They killed so many suspected sympathizers and the horrors did not stop there. Indeed, they had commenced weeks before when a British expeditionary force set forth from Allahabad. they killed so many suspected sympathizers and torched so many villages along the way that they were hard put to find sustenance for themselves and their animals. Now here you'll see a hanging party with the Scottish troops pausing for rest, but you'll see a number of bodies hanging from the tree. And this was a lithograph that was not, that was by no means produced by anyone out to in support of the troops, but this was shown as, you know, sort of just desserts for the rebels, and also farmers, almost any local people who could be, whom the British could convince themselves were sympathetic to the rebellion, were slaughtered along the way. Word of these excesses had already reached Kanpur before the slaughter of the innocents had commenced. The next, there we are. This is when the outraged British reoccupied Kanpur and peered over the rim of that bloody well and stepped into the blood-spattered Bibigar. They executed hundreds of captured sepoys and local people, burned villages, looted markets, and during a reign of terror, all but demolished the native city. Now here you will see a British, the third from the left is a British officer on the ground around him. You'll see the ropes that were used to pull the platform out from under the victims. This is these are local guardsmen over on the far left, and standing between the two men in white over on the right is the next man to be executed. And in Kanpur, at least, they made sure that that whoever escorted the victims would be the lowest caste Indians they could find. This picture may have been taken actually in Agra, but I've never been sure exactly where, but this was typical of the executions that were performed throughout North India during the mutiny. Okay, Kanpur became the staging area for the relief of Lucknow, which is where, I'm sorry, we could go to the next image. Yeah, this is another illustration of the British looting and terrorizing in the Kanpur district. Kanpur became the staging area for the relief of Lucknow, which is where my friend Rosie Llewellyn-Jones will pick up the story. But Kanpur holds some keys to the question put to this panel. There were two principal currents that converged into the flood of 1857. The company's humiliating disregard for India's old feudal order, and the alienation among the Bengal's army's native soldiers from their ever more ignorant and contemptuous officers, whom they darkly suspected of trying to break their caste and convert them to Christianity. I know that the 10th, for instance, the 10th regiment was known as the C regiment or something like that, because it had been required to cross the waters to the Burma campaign, and this also was a tremendous violation of their caste and customs. So this was more evidence that the new lights, as the born-again British young troops, young officers were termed, were out to convert them, to break their caste and convert them to Christianity. These two currents and their tributaries converge with particular velocity at Kanpur. What transpired there began as a mutiny, and had the native regiments not risen up, I very much doubt Nana Sahib would have turned on the British. But with the mutineers behind him, Nana Sahib drew not only on his own small army into the uprising, but also a great many local landholders and their militias. It is their involvement that causes me to lean toward calling 1857 an uprising. And yet even there, it was a sort of lateral uprising in that the rebellion was a reassertion of the old feudal order, with North India's deposed or defanged royals at the helm. As for Nana Sahib, after his defeat and escape into the hills, the British lost track of him. Some claimed he died of the ague not long after entering the pestilential Sarai. Others said he roamed the presidency for years, disguised as a mendicant. It cannot be said that the British moved heaven and earth to find him, for as the new imperial government began to realize, had they caught him and placed him on trial, Nana Sahib might have put up a convincing defense as the unwilling figurehead of a movement he could not control. Better to leave him rotting in the Sarai, they figured, or wandering the plains in penance than risk his exoneration. For the British Empire, Kanpur became sacred to the memory of the Europeans who had fallen there. And the next image, thank you. Oh, this was, yeah. This was not as a frequent mode of execution, blowing the rebels from guns. But it, in fact, Havelock, who headed the relief column, the first relief column, put a stop to it. But it did continue in various places. But hanging and shooting were the much more commonly used. Next. Thank you. A vast park was established to mark the burial well at the Bibigar. The route down to Sati Chowra was preserved as a kind of imperial Via della Rosa, and hard by a carefully preserved portion of the entrenchment. Go to the next image. Thank you. Arose, I'm sorry, and then to the next image. Oh, I'm sorry. This after in 1947, a crowd gathered in the park, which from which into which only the English had been allowed to venture, except for various gardeners, Mollies. And as soon as Indian independence came along, a crowd burst into the park and began to take the memorial well down. And it was removed eventually to the grounds of All Souls, but you can still see portions of it here in the garden. Here is a portion of the screen lying in the weeds. The next. Thank you. Hard by a carefully preserved portion of the entrenchment arose a vast memorial church dubbed All Souls, which contains an apse lined with panels bearing the names of the fallen. Next image. Yes, there. You could get some sense of the scale of casualties, is that each of these contains 50 or 60 different names of the over 1,000 people who were lost at Kanpur. Many of the images were either damaged, removed, or resurrected elsewhere. Next image, please. Yes. And by now, the well at Kanpur has been displaced as a symbol in India by the well at Jallianwala Bagh, where in 1919, hundreds of Indian men, women, and children cast themselves into a well to avoid a British fusillade. And last. This is the memorial at Jallianwala Bagh. And subsequent revelations about the company's wholesale retaliation has challenged the Raj's claims to moral hegemony. And I think I'll turn it over now to Rosie, if I may.
Andrew, I just wanted to thank you very briefly before we move on to Rosie, and to display your wonderful book. This is a very reasonably priced volume for one that contains about 100 full color illustrations and an authoritative text by the leading scholar on the Kanpur massacres. And I read your book when it was first published in the 80s, Andrew, as a descendant of British India. I didn't then know that I was also a descendant of the Hay family who perished at Kanpur, and that the names of about 5 Hays, most of whom were children, that are on the marble panels there were in fact relatives. The reason being that I suspect, like many families who'd lost members at Kanpur, their surviving relatives just completely blocked it out because of the horror of that episode. No one would want to dwell on the way those poor people died if you were a relative of theirs. And I subsequently found this out much later, but by that time, of course, I read your book, but even before that, the decade before that, visiting so many of these places that had associations for my family, I of course visited Kanpur because it was one of the great shrines of the British in India, and then I was very, very keen to read your book and very much appreciated it. And it's been a great honor to meet you. Now, let's find Rosie and spotlight her.
Yes.
Here we are. There you go, Rosie. I'm going to knock myself and Andrew off, and you can have center stage.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, I'm in distinguished company. Not sure I can live up to the 2 previous presentations, but let's have a go. Both Rana and Andrew have talked about the annexation of Awadh as one of the reasons for the uprising and the mutiny. So I thought I'd look at it in some detail. And can I move this forward on? Yes, I can. That's absolutely fine. So what I wanted to do was to examine some of the participants in the uprising. I think we'll call it the mutiny, actually. And it wasn't just soldiers. I think it's fairly important to distinguish the various factions that came together, which leads me to say that it was more of an uprising, started as a mutiny, and a mutiny is simply a military term when soldiers rebel against their officers or officers rebel against their commanders. But it certainly turned into a general uprising, and I'm quite interested in some of the people who participated in it. This is one of the most beautiful images we have of Lucknow before the rebellion started. It was taken by an Indian photographer, Ahmed Ali Khan, one of the first photographers who'd actually learned his trade from a French photographer, we believe. And it's taken early in the morning. You can see the shadows, and you can see some of the fantastic buildings that made up Lucknow, which was one of the most spectacular cities, perhaps even more so than Delhi, and certainly more so than Kanpur, which, as Andy said, just grew up as a cantonment, a British creation. Lucknow was entirely an Indian creation and came up in a remarkably short time between 1775, when the Nawabs moved their capital here, and annexation in 1856. And one thing I'd like to do, a lot of people think that the mutiny arose directly after the annexation. In fact, there was a period of more than a year. And I think that year is fairly important if we look at some of the things that happened during it. In a way, it's a kind of groundswell that rises to the actual uprising itself in May 1857. So we're going to look at some of the elements that made up the city before the actual outbreak. Oh, hang on. Can I move this forward myself? Or yes, that's absolutely fine. I'll just say next in future. So we've got the British Residency here, and I was quite interested in what Andrew said, that Wheeler's entrenchment was only 10 acres, which is very, very small compared to the area that the British Residency took up. This was well over 30 acres, some say as many as 37 acres, if you like. So we're looking at two vastly different areas. The residency itself was built about 1778, and it was a rather ugly building. It started off as a sort of Palladian villa, but they soon realized they had to put in screens and shades and all kinds of things to make it habitable in the heat of the plains. So here we are, a fairly conventional building. Next. And the annexation itself took place in February 1856. So as I said, it was well over a year before the actual outbreak. And this is a very romanticized view. The reason that Awadh was annexed was the East India Company believed that the Nawab, the ruler, was a degenerate man who couldn't administer his country successfully. But there were many other reasons too. First of all, the East India Company had got very, very greedy. And this led to a series of annexations, including the Punjab. It was a very wealthy city, as you can see. This was one of the finest entrances, the Rumi Darwaza. And as I say, it's a romanticized view of the East India Company going in peacefully, being welcomed by the inhabitants of Lucknow who wanted to get rid of their ruler. This absolutely is quite untrue, but it's worth looking at what actually happened at the time. Next, please. And this is one of the palaces. Lucknow was full of palaces. It was sometimes called the city of palaces. And this was one. This photograph is actually taken after the uprising, but it gives you an idea of the splendor of the Khurshid Manzil itself, which had been happily lived in by some of the rulers' wives. So they were booted out, and it became the officers' mess for the 32nd Regiment. Obviously, there was resentment if you were in an independent, semi-independent kingdom, and officers suddenly come in, foreign officers come in and start taking over your palaces, you're going to feel resentment. And this is also what happened with the other palace too. Next. The Alambagh Palace, this was a fairly recent palace. It was only finished about 1840. And again, it was for the rulers, for the Nawab's wives. And it becomes a British outpost because it's on the Kanpur road, that fairly important access road to Kanpur and to the British cantonments. And it became a significant outpost during events that unfolded during 1857 and 1858. Next, please. And here are the officers. Once they're in charge of the Alambagh Palace, they're lolling around on the veranda. And you can see that they've actually dragged out one of the sofas or couches from the palace itself. And they're lolling around on it, and they're smoking and they're drinking. Not the kind of thing you would imagine would go down terribly well with people who had known the palace during Nawabi days. Next, please. And we're going to look now at some of the participants, though in fact the king, Wajid Ali Shah, was the last ruler or Nawab of Awadh, and he was obviously based in Lucknow, the capital. He had taken himself off before the trouble started, but I wanted to look very, very briefly at his actions before he went. He was only ruler for a comparatively short time. He came to the throne, if you like, in 1847, and he had a large army. It was over 60,000 men, all kinds of people, and including what they call the Habshi Paltoon, which is the black regiment, if you like, made up of African mercenaries. So he's inspecting his army here. He started off with a great enthusiasm, if you like, to reform his kingdom, but the British were able to stop and halt every enterprise he wanted to take up. There was always a reason why the East India Company and the British resident would step in and say, well, you can't really do that. So he fairly shortly after his accession lost his enthusiasm for the army. But the important thing is, as I said, the army was over 60,000 men. And when annexation happened in February 1856, only half of this force could actually be accommodated by the East India Company, who wanted to form their own army, regiments, if you like, called the Awadh Irregular Force, but they could only take half of the Nawab's army. What they did with the other half, the other 30,000 men, was to disband them. They got small pensions and they were sent off back to their villages. But the important thing is that when they joined the king's army, one of the regulations was they had to bring their own weapons with them. And when they were disbanded in February and March 1856, they took their weapons with them. So you've got 30,000 disgruntled men roaming around Awadh, and this is before you even start. Next, please. Next, please. And then sorry, go back one. Then we've got Begum Hazrat Mahal, who came to prominence during the uprising itself. She was one of numerous wives of Wajid Ali Shah. He's sitting in the chair and he's being fanned by a lady with a fan. And the idea was that the Nawab, the king, would sit there and women would parade in front of him, rather like a fashion show, talent show, perhaps, if you like, and he would pick out those he fancied. Begum Hazrat Mahal was one of his favorites for quite a long time, actually, for about 6 years, and he wrote her passionate poetry, but things all went very, very wrong. He divorced her after they'd been married for about 8 years, and she'd actually produced a son, Burgess Khadr. But Wajid Ali Shah's mother was a very strong-minded woman and didn't think it was appropriate that he'd actually married lower-class women. And not only was Begum Hazrat Mahal a lower-class woman, she was actually of mixed race. Her father was an African slave. Her mother we're not quite sure about, but she was certainly a dark-skinned, lower-class woman. She was divorced, and when Wajid Ali Shah, the king, went to Calcutta, she was left behind in Lucknow with her young son, Burgess Khadr. So this is the second element in those opposing the British. We have the 30,000 disgruntled troops, formerly part of the king's army. We've got a disgruntled wife. Next, please. Next, please. Thank you. And we've also got the landholders, and Andrew touched briefly on these people who were suddenly stripped of their land. This is one of the most spectacular talukadar's houses, about 30 miles from Lucknow. It belongs to the Mahmudabad family. And in fact, the Mahmudabad family were very, very prominent in the uprising because they had such a lot of landholders, they were able to bring 2,000 of their own troops to join in the general uprising. And this is a pattern you see, that many of the landholders had their own small armies. Sometimes it was to fight off the revenue officials and generally to keep the peace in their area. So we're looking at a lot of men who are not soldiers. They're armed, certainly, but they're not part of the military. They're not part of the Nawab soldiers, and they're certainly not part of the Indian regiments commanded by British officers who also rebelled. So this is a third force. You've got a lot of elements coming together here. Next, please. And perhaps the fourth element, if you like, is the religious one. One of the most influential people for a very, very brief period during 1857 and 1858 was Ahmadullah Shah, who was a Maulvi, a priest. We know very little about him, but it's quite possibly had military training, and he may even have been to England at one point. We simply don't know. But religion played a very important part in the life of Lucknow. The Nawabs, as you may know, were Shias in a minority, and they had come initially from Iran. They beautified Lucknow within a very short period with the most amazing religious buildings, and Imambara is something peculiar to the Shia religion and not quite peculiar to Lucknow, because there's another big one further north. But you've got to look at religion, the religious elements, these wonderful buildings, and suddenly the British are coming in. They're not desecrating them, but there's an uneasy element about it. In a city that had been religious, it's now being broken down. You've got foreigners coming in. Next, please. Now, going to the residency itself, I think probably most of you are familiar with the story, so I'm not going to go through it in detail, but basically to say that the British Residency covered a large area. It wasn't just one building, as I showed you. It was a whole series of buildings. There were the Sikh positions, the barracks for the men. There was a school, there was a church, there was even a little Muslim shrine, which had been there before the residency was developed. There was a battery, there was a banqueting hall. So it was a large area. So if you can imagine a large semi-residential complex is suddenly under siege. And this was the most vulnerable area, the Kanpur battery, which faced onto the Kanpur road. And as I said, this was an essential area because it led to the British cantonment at Kanpur. And it was along this road that eventually the relief forces were able to come. So what you've got is a very, very narrow area between the exterior outside the residency walls, which are fairly poorly defended, and the residency itself. And although no fighting actually took place within the residency, it was constant bombardment for about 4.5 months. The siege started at the end of June, following the defeat of the East India Company regiments at Chinhat. They'd gone out to try and, I suppose, in a way, to forestall the mutineers who were gathering outside on the Faizabad road. They were severely defeated, retreated to the residency, and that's how the siege started. They were bombarded constantly, and this was the most vulnerable area. Next, please. And one of the things that did happen, in fact, on both sides, were mining. It's not something you think about in relation to a siege, but the Bengal engineers would actually mine under some of the buildings, trying to get outside the residency. And likewise, the Indian troops and the rebels, if you like, who was besieging the residency would actually dig underneath. And so here is one of the East India Company engineers, and he's listening for the sound of mining, for the sound of tapping, and he's ready with his gun. And interestingly enough, some of the people in the British regiment had actually been Cornish tin miners, so they were well aware of what happened in mines, the sounds and the smells and the noise. Next, please. And here is an imaginary picture of the battle for Secunderabad. It's very vivid. It's not that accurate, but it is very vivid. And this is actually on the front of my book on Lucknow. And next, please, we'll actually look at the reality. And one thing we were talking about earlier before we actually started the lectures was how you can actually fake photographs. Now, this is one of the significant images of the mutiny, together with the one that Andrew showed of the two men being hanged. This is probably also one of the most famous, one of the most celebrated, but I have to say it is a fraud. It's not exactly a fake, but what happened was that the photographer, Felix Beato, didn't arrive in Lucknow until March 1858. He came in when the city was recaptured. And what he appears to be showing is a scene of fighting the previous year in November. Now, we know that by the end of November, the whole area had been cleared because this was one of the places where the survivors of the Residency actually came on their way to safety. They were entertained here, the women and children were entertained here by Colin Campbell, who brought out tea and ginger biscuits for them. None of these bodies were here then. My theory is that, in fact, we know that a number of the bodies, a number of the dead from the 16th of September, 1857 fighting had actually been bundled, the corpses had been bundled into the room on the right-hand side of this garden palace. And my theory is that when Beato came in March the following year, he wanted a dramatic picture. He actually had the doorway unwalled, and you can see some of the rubble in front of it, and he had the corpses brought out and photographed them. So we don't necessarily believe everything we see. This was an egregious example of faking what had actually happened. Next, please. And this is the Secunderabad today. The central house was demolished, so you won't see that. What you will see are the walls surrounding it. And this is where the breach was supposed to have taken place. If you can imagine a walled garden, and the British troops are trying to get in, and what they're doing is pounding the walls with cannon. And eventually, after 3 hours or so, they're able to make a breach in the wall and pour through into the garden itself, where about 2,000 Indian troops had actually got themselves into a tight corner. They felt the British would not be able to get into the garden, and in fact they were wrong, and this led to an enormous massacre. Over 2,000 people, we think, were actually killed. 2,000 of the rebels were actually killed. Next, please. And eventually the siege was lifted. It was lifted by Havelock, Outram and Campbell, all generals, on the 17th of November. They met outside the Khurshid Manzil, and you can see the artist's impression of that palace I showed you earlier on, not quite accurate. In fact, the artist, Thomas Barker, had never been to India. He was working solely from descriptions and the few drawings that were there. But anyway, they managed to get out the survivors from the British Residency. Initially, we think there were many as 3,000 people had gone into the Residency in June of 1857. Obviously, a large number had died. Others had managed to get out, and among them were quite a number of Indian servants who were initially loyal to their British masters. They managed to escape. So by the time you actually got your relieving force here in November, it's about 1,500 people, and they are all safely evacuated. They go to Kanpur and then downriver to Allahabad and Calcutta. And what's interesting is that the Residency remains empty for several months. And it is now that the rebels start plotting how they're going to defend the city from its recapture by the British. And this is where Begum Hazrat Mahal comes into her own. She's leading the rebel troops, and she is supported rather half-heartedly by Ahmadullah Shah, the Molvi that I told you about. And unfortunately, there's a lot of conflict between the two and between their groups of followers. So when the two should be united to fight against the British, they're actually fighting each other, which I think is one of the reasons why the the recapture succeeded as it did. I'm not saying Lucknow could have held out forever. It couldn't have done, because the British brought in superior weapons and huge forces. There was no doubt that it could not have held out forever, but I think it could have held out for longer, and that might have given it a sort of crucial period of time. But anyway, it didn't, and this is what happened. So by March 1858, you got the British regrouping, and they're coming in with enormous forces. They've actually got the Nepalese general, Young Bahadur, is joining with his Gurkhas. It's a formidable force, and Lucknow cannot hold out any longer. Next, please. The statue of General Havelock, a huge hero in British eyes. He died shortly after the relief. He actually died of dysentery, he wasn't killed. And he became a sort of seminal figure, if you like, and he is still in Trafalgar Square. Well, there have been moves to remove him, but there's a lot of resistance, not least from his descendant, Sir Mark Havelock Allen. Next, please. And this is the last slide. This is the residency today. And to the credit of the Archaeological Survey of India, they have preserved the residency, not exactly as it was, because it was in a very dangerous state, as you can imagine, after 4.5 months of bombardment. Some parts of it had to be demolished for safety reasons, but what is there has been very well preserved indeed. You can see the remains of the church. You can see the graveyard where Sir Henry Lawrence lies. You can see some of the weaponry, and this is actually part of the banqueting hall, which still remains. It's well worth a visit. In fact, the interesting thing about Lucknow, and one of the things I brought out in my Battlefield Lucknow book, was there's still a very large amount which can actually take you back to 1857. You can see the remains of the Ulambagh Palace, where the British held out. You can see the Khurshid Manzil, which is now La Martiniere Girls' School. You can see the residence, you can walk around it, and you can still see part of the old palaces. This is why I thought it was worthwhile doing the book on Battlefield Lucknow. And I'm actually very grateful to Rana Chhina for giving me the chance to do this. So I think we'll finish now, and we'll take questions. Thank you. Do you want to go ahead, Valerie? Hello? Hello, Valerie?
You're muted.
I am not muted.
No, I mean, Valerie.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
good. Yes, I was so busy spotlighting everyone that I forgot to unmute myself, but never mind. I'm not the main act tonight. Well, look, thank you very much, all three of you. Very rarely does one find such scholars writing battlefield guides. So anyone who buys any of these books, which I'm afraid are sort of coming out as a mirror image, has done very well for themselves, because you are the leading scholars in the area, and these are fabulously produced books, over 100 color illustrations, cheapest chips in the UK, although I suspect the book, the edition is selling out very fast because Amazon only had a few copies. So hurry and buy what's left. Anyone who's interested. We have a few questions in the chat box, but I'm going to start with one of my own, directed at Andrew, Rosie, Rana in turn. It is, why was the quality of leadership so poor? Sir Hugh Wheeler's decision at Kanpur to entrench an indefensible site predestined his garrison to disaster. And why, Rosie, is Sir Henry Lawrence so revered? He only conducted the defense at Lucknow for a few months before he was killed, and he commanded at Chinhat, where the British were soundly defeated and lost their guns. Finally, Rana, why didn't the rebels manage to take the Residency? It wasn't a fort and ought surely to have fallen in the face of a coordinated attack by the vastly superior numbers besieging it. So,
shall I start with Wheeler?
Yes, please.
Well, Wheeler was a venerable general. He had just recently been passed over as commander-in-chief of the army. So he was somewhat demoralized and very sentimental about his men. He simply could not believe that men he had led into war in Punjab, in Afghanistan, and who had he had led an expedition up into Kashmir. He was very he was well regarded among, but what he didn't realize was how much the new officers under him were alienating his troops. Now, as to the notion about the why didn't he bring everyone into the armory and chose instead the entrenchment? I think the real reason was, I think he believed, for one thing, and at first the rebels had not intended to lay siege to the entrenchment. It was Nana Sahib or Azimullah who had convinced them to come back. They had taken the road to Delhi to join the mutineers there, but they were persuaded to come back and lay siege to the entrenchment. And the entrenchment was located right on the road, far south of Kanpur, of the southern edge of the cantonment, and so he thought that he would be there to greet the relief force under Havelock when it arrived. So it wasn't as entirely senile a choice as people make it out to be. But it was, I think, heavily influenced by his inability to recognize the danger that was afoot, and he spent a great deal of time telling the community that all would be well, and the revolution, if there was one, would pass over Kanpur, and I think that, even more than his choice of a defense, was his greatest error in the mutiny.
I think, Valerie, if you're looking at Henry Lawrence and his reputation, unlike Wheeler, he actually realized fairly early on that the Residency site could be defended. And he started to make sure that supplies were brought in, alcohol, food, grain, that kind of thing, and weaponry. So he did have the foresight to figure out that that was the best chance of defense, unlike Wheeler. He was killed shortly after the siege, I think within 4 days. I can't really explain the reverence with which he is noted even today. He certainly was, and you're quite right about Shinhad. And the interesting thing about that is that he actually hesitated for 24 hours before deciding to go out and tackle the rebels who were actually assembling at Nawabganj, which was about 18 miles east of Lucknow. Yeah, I mean, that was certainly a terrible mistake. So all I can say is that people were perhaps, rewarding his foresight. And obviously, the siege of the Residency is the counterpoint to the massacre at the Bibigo. It was successful. Kanpur wasn't.
Might I just add something, Rosie? His campaign, his march from Allahabad, entailed fighting 6 major engagements under very, very grueling circumstances. And the fact that he managed to get to Kanpur at all, let alone then proceed up to Lucknow and make his way into the Residency is significant. I think it's to his however brutally his men dealt with Indians along the way, as a military feat, it's fairly commendable.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, you're talking about Havelock. Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah.
So just to add to what Rosie said about Lawrence, I think the reason, so Awadh was actually Lawrence's swan song. If I may be wrong over here, but if I'm not mistaken, I think he was actually on his way out when he was called to come and become the commissioner of Awadh. He was going back to England, but Lawrence made a name for himself, not so well. I mean, of course, ultimately, he is forever associated with Lucknow, but the fact is that both the Lawrence brothers, Henry as well as John, had done, from the British point of view, a very, very commendable job with the Punjab after its annexation. And you still have, 2 of the still amongst the prime best boarding schools in India, the Lawrence schools, both in Sonar and Lovedale. And I think the one that was in Sonar was founded as a military asylum for children of orphan soldiers by Henry Lawrence, if I'm not mistaken. So Lawrence was earlier part of the Board of Administration in the Punjab, and he did a very, very good job of it. So I think that's where his reputation actually, rather, that's where he made his name for himself. Coming back to the question of the actual siege of Lucknow and why they couldn't carry it, I think there are 2. It's important also to remember that the defense of the Lucknow Residency, the defenders were not all British. You had a very significant Indian proportion within them. The Bailey Guard was actually manned entirely by Indian soldiers. You had 3 regiments, or remnants of 3 regiments, 13th, 71st, and I can't remember which was the 3rd one, which afterwards were all banded together and they formed what came to be known as the Regiment of Lucknow, which had as its cap badge the Bailey Gate of the Lucknow Residency. And then subsequently you had the Sikhs, which formed, as Rosie had mentioned, the Sikh corner and so on and so forth. But you touch upon a very important point, and that is the fact that from the Indian point of view, from the point of view of the rebels, there was a major crisis of leadership, because most of these Indian military commanders had been, their training and their exposure was up to platoon commander level. So they were not trained for a higher command control of a tactical battle. And that was a huge advantage as far as the British were concerned. And then, of course, there was the infighting, as Rosie has very rightly pointed out, which prevented them from acting in concert, so they were quite often kind of more bothered about each other than being bothered about the British. So I think that's one of the reasons.
Rana, thank you very much for those observations, which are coming from you at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. in New Delhi, having lived through an earthquake earlier this evening, and I'm profoundly grateful that your power remained on. Yes, reminding everyone that you've made a great effort to be part of our panel tonight, and thank you so much for that. Now we've got some questions and observations here in the chat box. And the first is, the supposed degeneracy of ruling kings and the Indian aristocracy in general, as Rosie said, was often used by the British as a pretext for deposing or removing them. The prejudice was later shared by later generations of freedom fighters and advocates of Indian independence who saw the aristocracy as a barrier to their aspirations. How did the events of 1857 shape this contradictory perception among people of apparently opposite sympathies? So you can all have a go at that one.
Well, it's an interesting observation, and I think while there are similarities, but there's they're not necessarily the same thing, because I do believe that particularly in the pre-1857 era, more often than not, it was a pretext for conquest, because a lot of these places, Awadh, as Rosie very rightly pointed out, was incredibly wealthy. And the only reason that the East India Company went in was because they wanted the wealth, period. I mean, so it was just an excuse. The degeneracy and all the rest of that was just an excuse. In later years, as far as the Indian view of some of the aristocracy or the Rajas, Maharajas, unfortunately, they tended to live up to to that image, and because they had been reduced, again, as Rosie had pointed out, even before the annexation, even before the crown takes over the administration of the Indian Empire, there was already interference in the governance of Indian states by Indian rulers. But once the crown becomes paramount, then increasingly the Indian aristocracy, the Indian feudal system is just literally, I mean, it's a figurehead, right? And so a large proportion of them, then they end up kind of living up to that caricature, and they then realize that the only reason that their survival actually depends on their being loyal to the imperial authority. And so, yeah, that causes a lot of problems. It's not across the board. You still found some very enlightened, very progressive rulers amongst the Indian Maharajas, and I'm now talking between the period 1857 to 1947. But by and large, a fairly large number of them were very happy with, playing the role of rich, pampered playboys, and I mean, equivalent of that.
A little like the Windsors. No, yeah, I think to look at it from a feudal point, I mean, a feudal period, you would look at it very differently from the way we look at it now, as that nice quote of yours said, that just these are very, very different frames of frames of mind. They're practically different planets that we're talking about. And these many of those Rajas were claimed descent from the sun. I mean, they were regarded as fundamental parts of the religion of their kingdom, and so I've been fascinated by the princes for years. One of the ones I know best is Kapurthala in the Punjab, and Jagatjit Singh, whose coronation album I happened to purchase, was a fascinating case of that, because he built a house in Paris. He had mistresses in the Riviera, but at the same time back home, he was exceedingly. He built the first library, and he built schools, and clinics, and he was a very responsible in that sense, despite all the opulence. That so it's very complicated to look at them from our point of view. It's fairly clear. Why would they get a princely purse? Why would that continue well into the 1960s, I think, or 70s? And why? But looking back at them, they really symbolized a great deal to their people, their subjects.
That's correct. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Right. Now let's look. There's some other questions. Scrolling down. How widespread in India was the discontent? Was it just a Bengal phenomenon, or what about other parts of India?
May I? I would say that it was largely a Bengal phenomenon, although not entirely. But if you just look at the pattern of the mutiny was largely confined to the Bengal army, which was the largest and perhaps the most operationally significant. I think, please don't quote me, but out of roughly about 87 or 85 infantry regiments, 75 of them mutinied. About the 10 Bengal light cavalry, the regular cavalry regiments, all of them mutinied. Out of the 17 Bengal irregular cavalry regiments, I think 10 of them mutinied. So you had a very so it was essentially Bengal, and there are very specific reasons for that, and not just the military reasons, but as we'd earlier briefly had touched upon, both social, cultural, political, economic. So it was that the northern belt, the Indo-Gangetic plain, it largely leaves both the Madras and the Bombay presidency untouched. And I think, as we've more or less kind of agreed, that it was the mutiny, or the military mutiny, that provided the catalyst that lit the spark, and then everybody else kind of joins into that thing. So, and that doesn't happen in the South. So it was largely a North Indian thing. And here is the interesting thing, is the role of the Punjab, because Punjab actually held everything in the balance. If the Punjab had gone against the British, the Raj wouldn't have survived. Now, there have been scholars in recent years who actually say that it's not as black and white as is usually projected. And while the Punjab states, the Maharajas, did side with the British, but the populace actually was in the balance until it became clearer to them that the British would succeed. But that's, I mean, there are more layers to that, but we won't go into that at this point.
I remember Sir John Lawrence ordered the Punjab movable column under Nicholson to come down and besiege Delhi, and that was that was caused quite a change and a shake-up with Nicholson's presence at the siege of Delhi and all his siege guns, which fought their way down from the Punjab. And very interesting about the Punjab, because it was a recently subdued area. The Sikh wars weren't that long, what, 10 years or something beforehand? It was really quite remarkable that.
Yes, actually, I mean,
Yeah,
1849, yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry, I ran into that with Wheeler's biography. He was one of his last major campaigns before he was sent to Kanpur was to lead an expedition of Sikh soldiers. Not even a couple of years after the last of the wars in the Punjab, he led a Sikh expedition up into Kashmir. So there was some strange alchemy there, having to do with perhaps some religious reasons, or some martial code, I don't know what, but that led the Sikhs to be a major force on the British side during the mutiny. A great many Sikh soldiers had fought in Lucknow and all across the Bengal.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So it was actually fortuitous for the British that the Second Sikh War happened when it did, because if it hadn't, it would have happened in 1857, and
Right.
the Raj would never have survived.
Yeah.
I have a kinsman, one of our kinsmen raised one of the 10 Risalas of Hodson's horse, who actually rode to Delhi with Hodson in 1857. I think the reason why the Punjab sides with the British at that point in time is that they have recently been annexed. They bear this is my reading, and I may be wrong. I mean, I'm happy to debate this with somebody, but they bear a resentment against the Bengal Sepoy, against what they used to call the Hindustanis. Now, the interesting thing is that this distinction between a Punjabi and a Hindustani, I mean, I've heard it. One of the oldest men I ever spoke to was a cavalryman who had enlisted in 1904 in 21st Prince Albert Victor's own cavalry. And he was wounded during the advance to Sharkat in the First World War. And he talks about his time. He's in this ambulance being evacuated to a base hospital. The driver is British. And he says, there's me, and there were two Hindustanis. So Hindustani, for people who not familiar, is actually people from Hindustan, from India. He was a Punjabi. He did not identify himself. So, he says, I was a Punjabi, and there were these two Hindustani sepoys. So this resentment against the Hindustanis was one. The second thing, what Rosie very rightly pointed out, the same cause that was there in Awadh. You see, the army of the Sikh Darbar was one of the most formidable military machines in Asia, and it was actually it was touch and go that the British actually managed to defeat them. So, as a matter of fact, when the Sikh army is defeated in 1849, this is recorded fact that the British had to parade the Sikh artillery park all the way from Lahore to Calcutta to make the people of Hindustan believe that, look, we actually managed to defeat them. They're lost. So that resentment was there. Then there was this disbanded soldiery, right? There were this huge army that had been used to warfare as a way of life. And along with that way of life, please remember, in those days was loot. So, it wasn't just the love of fighting. I went and you fought and you got stuff back. And this was a chance, once again, of loot and plunder. You had all this huge disbanded soldiery that had nothing to do. And they took the opportunity.
And no love lost between the Muslim rebels and the Sikhs. And a great deal of respect that the British afforded Sikhs as one of their martial races, as they called them. So their attitude, the way the British officers may have treated their Sikh soldiery may have been very different from the way they treated Hindu and Muslim soldiers. Is that fair enough or not?
Well, yes, that's true, but I think that's largely happens post mutiny. What actually happens is in about 1855, the British, I mean, they want symmetry. So you have these chaps coming from the Punjab, the Sikhs with beards and turbans, and they're breaking the symmetry of the ranks. So they issued orders. They say, you guys have to shave off your beards. And these said,
Oh, wow.
we didn't sign up for that. So a lot of them actually take their discharge and they head back home. So that what you're saying is right, but that happens subsequently rather than before.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
We just have we have a comment here from someone from Lucknow about Lawrence of Lucknow, and the observation is perhaps his kind character, for which he was revered as Lawrence Sahib, was also a factor in Lawrence becoming an icon, I suppose, of the siege of the Residency at Lucknow. Well, we've got a few other questions. We might run over time if you don't mind. I've got a question for Andrew, which I think a number of people will be quite interested in, which is, could the Kanpur garrison have held out in time to be rescued by Havelock? You mentioned in your book that they were down to a few days' rations, and Wheeler, who didn't want to surrender to Nana Sahib, he'd got his measure at long last, was nevertheless persuaded by his officers and the civilians who couldn't take any more. Could they have held out?
Well, there was a British Army officer who had been in charge of the defense of the unfinished barracks. There was a row of unfinished barracks outside of the entrenchment, and they were occupied, most of them, by members of Wheeler's garrison to keep down on the sniper fire and so on. Anyway, he was a particularly valiant officer. He had led a sortie out into the rebel artillery and spiked some guns in the night and so on. He's he was basically he basically overruled Wheeler. I mean, I think Wheeler was done. His boy had been beheaded by a round shot right in the same room with his father. I don't think there was much left of Hugh Wheeler by the time that offer of safe passage was made. And I think once the word got around to the rest of the entrenchment, the rest of the garrison, that this offer had been made, they looked around at the children, the women and children especially, and just thought, we're not going to survive. And I think they were right to think this. We're not going to survive another assault on the entrenchment. Our only chance is to trust in this offer and go to Allahabad if possible.
Yes, fatal decision, as
yes,
it turned out.
It was.
They weren't to know, fortunately. A question here from the same questioner for Rosie, which is, what would have been the strategic consequences if Lucknow had fallen?
Sorry, can you say that again, Valerie?
What would have been the strategic consequences if Lucknow had fallen?
Oh, that's an interesting question. It was Canning who insisted that Lucknow was actually the key city that had to be recaptured in that sort of dreadful winter of 57 to 58. Canning said, you have to recapture Lucknow. And in fact, Campbell was quite reluctant to do this. He thought they didn't have enough forces to do it. He thought it was more important to, deal with other areas of Awadh but Lucknow was so significant. And in fact, that did prove to be the turning point. If it had not been captured at that time, no, I still think the company and the British would have won. It would just have prolonged it.
And we have, oh, sorry, were you going to say something, Andrew, about?
No.
Yeah. We've got one last question, which is actually directed at Rana. And it is, thank you very much for your fascinating talk. How interested are Indians in the uprising? Is there much battlefield tourism in Kanpur and Lucknow, apart from British tourists?
Gosh, good question. I should think it's still it's still an industry that is in its infancy, but increasingly we do have a younger generation that is interested in these issues. I mean, you just have to look at, for instance, literature. Earlier, you found very few Indian origin, when I say Indian, South Asians, Indian, Pakistani authors, scholars who were looking at anything that happened pre-47 from the military point of view, right? But now you have a lot of young authors who are writing excellent books on these subjects. You have also an increasingly wealthier middle class younger professionals, and so they do engage with this. I think it's just a matter of time. Ultimately, I always feel that if you create a resource, then people will come to it. And the fact that we've made this beginning, and this is actually de facto, apart from the one book which we had earlier done on the Indian Army Corps on the Western Front. But I think this is really the first mass-produced, or rather, these are the first books that cater to a mass audience. And so it will pick up. However, so let me give very quickly, the answer to that is yes, because I think we do have, in most of these cities, you have smaller groups which, either they're local heritage societies, or they are, just young academics, and they will take tourists or interested people out on these heritage walks, which go beyond just the purely military, but they also do include these military aspects in them.
Well, thank you, all of you, for these absolutely wonderful books, which you're seeing inside out, unfortunately, with the type. We're very, very lucky to have had with us tonight the leading scholars on Lucknow and Kanpur, and I very much look forward, Rana, to your book in due course on Delhi, the battle, Delhi, the city battlefield. They're all city battlefields. Really, I don't know whether there are books of these quality that have been produced, certainly not in Britain, in the US, where you also had city battlefields. I'm thinking of Fredericksburg and Virginia and some of those other cities. Vicksburg, I guess, too. But these are absolutely models of their type. And hearty congratulations. And thank you so much for your most interesting and informative talks tonight. We're all indebted. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie, for organising it.
Thank you.
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Super session. Many thanks to all from one of our
Bye, everyone.
attendees.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye,
Sweet
everyone.
dreams.
Bye.
Good night. Thank
Good
you.
night. Thank you.
Good night.